carbon dating is, and there are any number of people you can go read, and they'll tell you that it's right or wrong. So she's been around for at least 5,000 years, possibly longer. The first place she shows up is in the Halupa tree myth, which most people agree was written somewhere around 3000 BCE. Now, around means like 500 years, give or take. All right? And it was written in ancient Samaria, or what's called Sumer Akkad. Basically, it was at a time when the Sumerians and the Akkadians were living in the same place. What that actually means is the Akkadians came in, kicked the living poop out of the Sumerians, and said, hey, nice place, we're going to stay. And basically, by the way, show us how to farm, because that's really cool. We don't have to go around and hunt and be hunter-gatherers anymore. The Sumerians were a matriarchal culture originally, based on what we found in places like we found in several places in Mesopotamia. It seems that most cultures up to about 4000 BCE were probably matriarchal. Women ran religion and government. Men were in charge of public works and domestic labor, which basically means the women said, dig there, and the men said, okay. So it's not all that different from now. Basically, women ran everything, and then the Akkadians showed up. And the difference between the Sumerians and the Akkadians, they had mother goddesses. They had mother earth goddesses. And the Akkadians had male warrior sky gods. And so they wrote this really nifty myth about how one of their warrior sky gods came down and smacked the living crap out of the earth goddess and banished her. And this is called the Halupa tree myth. In the Halupa tree myth, which is kind of similar to the Eden myth, don't hurt me, this goddess in the Akkadian pantheon named Inanna finds a tree near the Euphrates and thinks it's beautiful and takes it to her holy garden and plants it. And decides to give it 10 years to mature so she can use it to make a throne and a marital bed and several other things that are related to progress and civilization. 10 years go by, she comes back, and there are unwanted visitors in the tree. In the branches of the tree is a thing called an anzu, or zoo bird, which is kind of like a griffin. It's basically it's either a winged lion or a bird with a lion's head, depending on which description you're going with. In the trunk of the tree, she finds what they refer to in the Lake Cuneiform as the dark maiden Lilith. And it says that she's made her home in the trunk of the tree. And the branch and the roots of the tree is a serpent who could not be tamed. Any of this sound familiar? All right. The problem is that Inanna, who is one of the most powerful goddesses in the Akkadian pantheon, basically does the weirdest thing. She sits down and starts to cry. She is the most powerful goddess they've got. And she just sits down and starts crying. Because apparently she's not powerful enough to expel any of them from the tree. So she does what any helpless damsel does, based on Akkadian points of view. She goes to every man in her family until one of them agrees to come and help her. You know, you guys are totally equal until someone needs couch moved. No, I'm just kidding. So she finally gets her brother Gilgamesh to show up with his ridiculously heavy hammer, or axe, and his armor, which all of it weighs like a Volkswagen. Like his axe is like 1,500 pounds. It's insane. And he basically smacks the head of the serpent, crushes the head of the serpent. The Anzu bird and its babies fly off. And this is where we get this really interesting phrase that Lilith escaped into the wild, uninhabited lands, which is a very important thing. And this is what I mean when I say the Lilith expulsion. At this point in time, humans believed that gods existed in a geographical location. If I wanted to worship that god, I went to the city of that god. If I wanted to worship Inanna, I went to Uruk. If I wanted to worship Gilgamesh, I went to Uruk. If I wanted to go to any particular place to worship a particular god, I had to go where that god existed. Well, Lilith was most likely a very popular cult until, and I don't mean cult in like the Hare Krishna way. I mean, a cult just means basically a religious group in ancient mythology. We don't mean it in the way that most people mean it now. And so pretty much what this myth was telling Lilith's followers was, if you want to worship your goddess, that's fine. But you can't do it here. You have to leave the city. Now, this is something, oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This is something I really enjoy talking about is I think very few people now can really understand what it means to live in a world with zero social services. In an ancient world, a city provided three things. One, commerce. Gave you a place to buy, sell, and trade. Two, walls. Walls were great because you didn't know who lived south, north, east, or west of you, and you didn't know when they were going to figure out that they could ride horses and not eat them. And once most men, when they figured that out, started pillaging and burning and destroying. And the third thing it gave you was somewhere to gripe. If someone said, hey, give me 50 minas and I will build you a cart, and you paid them and they were delivered on the cart, you could go somewhere and say, hey, this guy never gave me what I paid for it. And they basically gave you a quart. Outside of those walls, none of that stuff existed. Unless you were in an armed caravan, you were on your own. And imagine if you had to move your family from Dallas to Arlington. It's not that far. But imagine if between Dallas and Arlington, anyone who came across you and decided they liked your stuff, they liked your wife and children, there was nothing to stop them from slitting your throat, selling your stuff in the nearest place, enslaving your children, and, pardon me for the graphicness, but raping your wife to death. There was nothing to stop them. And so this myth was a way of saying, okay, you can enjoy the comforts of the city, but you can't worship Lilith anymore. You want to worship Lilith? You have got to go. And I believe they did go. That's the funny thing. Lilith ends up in 3 other civilizations in ancient times. Lilith's Eastern Sumerian name in the dialect of Eastern Sumeria was Kal. And at the time, a lot of people said there are some similarities between Kali, from the Hindu Dharma religion, and Lilith. And a lot of people said that's impossible. There was no trade going on between the Hindus, or the Shindu Kush peoples, and the ancient Mesopotamians. Then we found the cylinder seal with elephants on it. There's only one problem. We found it in Mesopotamia. There are no elephants in Mesopotamia. Which means the only way they would have known to draw elephants is if they saw one. And the only way they could have seen one is if either someone from India brought an elephant to Mesopotamia, or someone from Mesopotamia went to India and saw an elephant for themselves. What's that? Well, yeah, but that would have been an even worse trip from where they were coming. From the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley to Africa, they had to cross a really, really dangerous area, but there actually was a trade road that went up to India. And so they could have traveled with armed caravans, ended up in India. That's where we get Kali. The other group traveled east until they hit the Mediterranean coast. And there are 2 main culture groups in the Mediterranean coast at this time along the Mesopotamian border, or along the Mesopotamian shore. And those are the Judeans, and those are the Phaeacians. Phaeacians were seagoing people. The Judaic people were just starting to come up with a monotheistic religion, and they went on what's called an iconoclastic campaign, which basically means, you don't believe in our God, we kill you and burn everything you own. And they were very good at it. There's a young king by the name of Josiah who pretty much raped and killed and pillaged and burned everybody who wasn't a Jewish or didn't believe in the Jewish monotheistic God for quite some time. And so suddenly the coast of Mesopotamia became very unsafe. So there are only 2 avenues of escape, were to either head back west, where they knew there was nowhere for them, or to jump onto the ships with the Phoenicians. Now the interesting thing is that in northern dialect of Sumerian, Lilith's name is Lam, which later got her confused with another goddess named Lamashtu, but we'll get to that in a minute. However, what's interesting is you have in Greek mythology Lamia, which is very similar to Lilith. She eats babies, she's a goddess of illness and sickness. She's very similar to what Lilith eventually became. And I believe that they jumped ship with the Phaeacians and ended up in Greece. The other place I believe they ended up, some of them, was on the island of Crete. The reason I believe this is because there are cylinder seals of Lilith standing atop an Anzu bird, on its back, in this position with a snake in each hand. On the island of Crete, they have found dozens of small